Have you ever been treated like a nuisance in your own home? Have you ever felt that, suddenly, what you built with so much sacrifice became a target of ambition at the hands of the one you loved most? Because that's exactly how my nightmare began. Overnight, my home, the place where I raised my son, where every corner holds a memory, a battle won, a hidden tear, was no longer mine. It was that simple. They forged my signature. They planned everything behind my back. And before I knew it, the real estate scam was already underway. My house was being sold, and me, I was just the old lady who doesn't need so much space, as they themselves said, laughing. At first, I thought it was all in my head. Have you ever had that feeling that something was wrong, but no one confirms it? First, they started going through my things. They took pictures of the house, random comments like, "This room is too much, you'd feel better in a smaller place." I listened and swallowed hard. I wanted to believe it was concern, that it was care. But deep down, I could already feel it. It was as if, after everything I'd done, after years of sacrificing myself for my children, I'd become a piece of furniture out of place, a nuisance, invisible, but annoying. I remember the day I realized something serious was happening. I came back from the market with my hands full of bags, and the key wouldn't fit in the lock. They changed the locks on my house. My house. They told me it was a mistake, for security reasons. But my heart already knew. This wasn't carelessness, it was the beginning of the end. They were already getting rid of me. With a forged signature, and a lot of coldness. And the worst part, hearing from my own son. She doesn't need a home, she needs a caregiver. As if I had stopped being a person, as if I had stopped being a mother. Have you ever heard something like that from someone you raised with so much love? Because it tore me apart. I didn't cry at the time, I remained silent. A heavy silence, the kind that burns inside. But in that moment, something inside me changed. They wanted me to stay quiet, to accept, to disappear. But I decided to do something different. I didn't call them, I didn't ask for explanations. And I didn't cry either. Instead, I sought help. And that's when everything started to change. That's when they discovered that the woman they'd tried to silence still had a voice. Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever felt that not only a material possession was taken from you, but also your history, your dignity, your place in the world? Because what happened next, they never imagined. I'm not a lawyer. I've never been one of those women who bangs on the table or raises their voice. I've always believed that respect is earned calmly, with presence, with care. But in that moment, I realized that if I didn't stand up for myself, no one would. And that's when another version of me was born, a version they didn't know. I sought help where I never imagined I wouldn't. I found an ally, someone who looked me in the eye, listened without rushing, and said, "Ms. Martha, this is a crime, and you have every right to fight." And I fought, with fear, yes, with sleepless nights, but with the certainty that it wasn't just for me, it was for so many other women, so many other mothers and grandmothers, who have been silenced, ridiculed, treated like a burden. Maybe even you, on the other side of the screen. Maybe this story reminds you of something you experienced or witnessed. And if you remember, if it hurts inside, talk to me. Leave in the comments what touched you most, what revolted you. Because when you share, you don't just express yourself, you also strengthen this network of women and men who will no longer accept silence. Your participation here is what keeps this space alive. When you comment, like this video, and subscribe to the channel, you help this story reach more people who need to hear it. People who, like me, have felt alone and betrayed, but who still carry a hidden strength within. And don't think the story ends there, because what happened next was even more surprising. My name is Martha. I'm 74 years old. For almost my entire life, I've been a seamstress. I sewed wedding dresses, children's clothes, and hemmed pants that seemed never-ending. Every stitch I made carried a piece of my story. It wasn't just fabric passing through my hands, it was life happening. And while I sewed, I raised my son, alone, without asking anyone for anything. It wasn't easy, but I never complained. Because every sacrifice had a name, a reason, and love. We lived in a small but cozy house, a simple place, yet full of soul. Every wall was covered in tiny fingerprints, crooked colored pencil drawings, yellowed photos with tape holding back the passage of time. It was our refuge, our world. And I made sure he grew up knowing that, even with little, we could have everything, long as we had respect, affection, and truth. It was with this mindset that I raised him. And, For a long time, I thought it had worked. He grew up smiling, polite, the kind of person who would pull out a chair for me and call me my queen. I remember the times he'd come home from school with drawings of me, always with the huge heart on his chest and a sun in the corner of the page. He'd say I was the sunshine of his life, and I believed him. I believed him because I never wanted to see anything else. I never wanted to look behind the scenes. Maybe I was blinded by love. Or maybe it was more convenient for me to think everything was going well. Time passed. He grew up, went to college, and came back different. More hurried, more ambitious, less present. I told myself it was just life happening, that it was just a phase. But the phase became routine, and the distance turned into silence. Visits became fewer, calls grew colder, and yet, I continued to make his favorite meal every Sunday. I continued to wash his sheets, save his photos, buy him things. I continued to believe it all still made sense, but the hidden truth is that, while I kept the house alive, waiting for his return, he was already building another plan. A plan where I didn't fit, where my existence was a hindrance, and I didn't see it coming, because I always looked at him with a mother's eyes, those eyes that see beyond mistakes, that forgive before they hurt, that love without demands. I told my friends he was busy, that it was work, that he'd show up soon. I lied to them and to myself, trying to hold on to an image that had already been shattered. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was subtle, slow, like turning off the lights in one room at a time. First came the absence, then the comments. The decisions made without consulting me. And finally, the coldness, the way he started looking at me as if I were a problem to be solved. Maybe you understand what I'm talking about. Maybe there's someone in your life who also changed little by little, until they became unrecognizable. And the most painful thing is realizing that it was all being constructed before our eyes, but we chose not to see it, because seeing hurt, seeing meant accepting that love was no longer enough. The house, once synonymous with safety, began to feel like a minefield. I walked slowly through the rooms, trying to overhear half-heard conversations, trying to piece together pieces that should never have been scattered. I began to feel like a visitor inside, as if that story, my story, was being rewritten by hands that never understood what it took to make it happen. And yet, I made him coffee. I folded his clothes. I kept his memories, as if that simple gesture could hold back what was already slipping through my fingers. As if it were enough to be good, to be useful, to be the strong woman I've always been. But sometimes, being strong isn't enough. Sometimes, strength needs to become decision. It was on an ordinary morning that everything began to reveal itself more clearly. The way he avoided my gaze, the conversation that stopped when I entered the room, the papers on the table, and, even without yet understanding what was happening, I felt it. I felt that my life was about to change. And not by my choice. I still didn't know exactly what they had done, but it felt like something had been ripped from me, as if the walls of that house were holding secrets I myself never authorized. I felt like a supporting character in my own life, while other people made decisions for me. It was then that I began to understand that the blow wasn't just material, it was emotional. It was about removing me from the center of my own existence. And it was this realization, hard, icy, almost silent, that woke me up, not like a scream, but like a whisper insistent within my chest. Because sometimes, the greatest turning point begins when we finally stop being silent. At first, it was just random comments, disguised as concern. Kevin spoke softly, as if choosing each word so as not to sound harsh. Susan smiled a lot. She was always good with sweet words, the kind that hide a bitter taste when you swallow them. One day, they were both in my kitchen, offering me tea and saying they were thinking about my well-being. They used expressions like ease, more comfort, freedom, and I stood there listening, trying to understand why it sounded more like a plan than a concern. A smaller apartment would be perfect for you, Mom. Something more modern, with an elevator, 24-hour security. You deserve that. And she added, looking at my backyard, this house is a lot of work, isn't it? Everything's so big, so much to take care of alone. But I liked that work. I cared for my house like someone caring for what's left of their own identity. Every plant I watered, every sweep of the sidewalk, was a reminder that I was still here, present, capable, whole. But there, in that conversation that felt like a rehearsed script, something began to bother me. It wasn't just the content of what they were saying, it was the atmosphere, the silence between sentences, the way they avoided looking at me for long stretches. A strange feeling settled in my chest, as if, suddenly, I was being pulled out of a story I'd written myself. And then the paperwork began. First, some bank documents that needed updating. Then, something about the home insurance. Just sign, here, Mom, it's no big deal. We'll take care of everything for you. And that's when my body reacted. My hands sweated. My heart sank. The small print seemed to dance before my eyes. I said I'd read it calmly later, and I saw their expressions change, as if my delay were an inconvenience, as if my caution were an offense. It was at this point in the journey that I realized there was a hidden truth behind all that talk. I didn't yet know what it was, but I knew it existed, because mothers who raised with an open heart and their feet on the ground have a kind of radar that never fails. We sense when something takes us off center, when decisions start to be made behind the curtain, like backstage in a play where we only serve to occupy the stage, but not to choose the script, and it was eating away at me. I began to distrust, even the affection. I began to wonder if the hugs were real, or if they were trying to keep me calm until the right time to cut the cords. One day, I opened the kitchen drawer and found spare keys, new, wrapped. It was as if they were preparing the groundwork for when I was no longer there. We're just getting ahead of ourselves, Mom, he said when he saw I'd noticed. But getting ahead of ourselves for what? For whom? The impact of realizing that your own family may be acting as if you were an obstacle is difficult to describe. It's not a pain that explodes. It's a pain that seeps in, silently, like a leak in the wall. You only notice it when it's too late. And yet, I didn't scream. I didn't confront. I kept observing, because I understood that sometimes you need to be silent to better hear the noises. Their mindset was different. Everything was about practicality, about getting it done quickly, about making everyone's lives easier. But at no point did anyone ask what I wanted, what I felt. It was as if my will no longer mattered, as if I had lost the right to make decisions for myself, as if my existence was being managed. And then came the biggest sign of all. I arrived home to find a real estate agent in the backyard, a stranger with a clipboard and a technical eye, analyzing every detail of the house. Susan, smiling as always, introduced me to him as a future possibility. She said he was just there to do an informal appraisal. I hadn't even known the house needed an appraisal. I felt like a bit player, again, as if my life was being measured, estimated, and priced without my permission. That night, I sat on the porch and stared at the sky for hours. I wondered how it all began. Where had I stopped being a priority? And more than that, where had I become a problem to be solved? But even with a heavy heart, something inside me began to awaken. A part of myself I had buried, not out of anger, but out of necessity, out of survival. And that's when I started paying more attention to the details, reading everything carefully, keeping copies, writing down dates, not because I wanted to confront them, but because I needed to understand how far this was going, how far they were willing to go, while believing I didn't understand. On my birthday, he showed up with flowers, roses, just like old times, a beautiful, well-kept bouquet, wrapped in that cellophane that makes a noise when you touch it. Kevin hadn't brought flowers in years. Not when my back went bad, not when I ended up in the hospital with high blood pressure, but that day, he showed up with flowers and a gentle smile, as if nothing was out of place. Susan followed, carrying a cake, saying she'd made it herself. "Today is the day to celebrate the strongest woman I know," she said, as she set the plates on the table. That scene shattered me inside. It was as if, suddenly, everything had returned to normal. As if the smiles that had seemed forced days before were now lighter, more sincere. They laughed, recalled stories from Kevin's childhood, talked about trivial things, asked me if I was happy, and me. I wanted to believe. I really wanted to, because a mother's heart constantly searches for signs that love still exists amidst the silence. And in that moment, everything inside me wished that affection were genuine. I felt guilty. Guilt for having suspected. Guilt for having imagined they might be against me. How could I think that about my own son? I wondered. When he handed me a white envelope, saying it was just a seat adjustment, I didn't hesitate. My glasses were in the kitchen, but I didn't want to break the moment. "It's just a signature, Mom. Simple, trust me." And I signed. I signed without reading. I signed with a softened heart, a confused mind, a soul yearning for peace. It wasn't just a signature. It was the symbol of my surrender. It was when I let go of the vigilance, the fear, the suspicion, and surrendered to the idea that maybe I was wrong, that maybe they really wanted the best for me. And for a few weeks, everything seemed different. He started calling more. She started bringing soup, asking if I needed anything from the grocery store. I felt cared for, present. It was a calm I hadn't experienced in a long time, but behind that calm was something I hadn't yet grasped. Like a movie where this soft soundtrack masks the sound of an engine about to explode, there was a disconnect between what I saw and what I felt. Small details, the way they looked at certain drawers, the whispered conversations on the phone, the sudden rush to settle matters. I began to notice subtle changes. Documents were disappearing from their usual locations. A bank card that no longer worked. Phone calls from strangers asking for the property manager. It was as if I were watching behind the scenes of a play where I was the main character but not the author. And it affected me in a way I couldn't explain. With every kind gesture, my heart sank, because I no longer knew what was true and what was scripted. I could no longer distinguish between care and manipulation. And that, for me, was the worst kind of confusion. When love turns to doubt, their transformation was silent but precise, like someone adjusting the pieces of a calculated plan, waiting just for the right moment to press the final button. And I found myself surrounded by kindnesses that felt more like traps than affection. It was a kindness that always came with something for me to sign, some data for me to confirm, some vague phrase about guaranteeing everyone's future. There were days when I almost believed it. There were days when the hug seemed sincere, but all it took was a sidelong glance, an exchange of text messages, a frozen expression when I entered the room, for everything to become scrambled again. It was like living in a scenario where every gesture had a subtext, where the surface was calm, but the depths hid a current thought, and yet I remained there, waiting for an explanation that never came. Waiting that, perhaps, time would prove me wrong, that it was all just my imagination. But deep down, something was already shifting inside me too. A kind of painful lucidity, a slowly growing realization, like a seed sprouting after a winter too long. I still didn't know what they'd done exactly, but I knew that the signature I'd given on my birthday had been more than a gesture of trust. It had been the beginning of a turning point, just not the turning point they'd hoped for. Because even when our hearts break, they also learn. They learn to see what they couldn't see before. They learn to seek meaning between the lines. They learn to stop asking for permission to exist. And it was in this silence filled with revelations that something in me finally awakened. I still had no proof, but I was certain. And sometimes, the certainty of the soul is all we need to begin to rise. It was exactly 15 days after my birthday. I was washing the morning dishes, distracted, thinking about nothing and everything at the same time, when the mailman came by and left a white envelope in the box. It was a simple letter, nothing special on the outside. I opened it like opening another bill, another note, but a quick glance was enough for the world around me to change its tone. It was a formal notice of sale. My house was for sale. The house where I'd lived for over 40 years, where my son took his first steps, where I planted my garden, where I cried hidden in corners when the world felt too heavy. That house was no longer just in my memories now. It was on paper, listed with a market value, described in square meters, an asset, a commodity. My first reaction was disbelief. I thought it was some kind of mistake, maybe a common scam. I called the number on the paper. On the other end, a calm, professional voice confirmed. Yes, Ms. Martha. This is the documentation for the sale in progress. The signature has been notarized. Everything is in process. A notarized signature, but it wasn't mine. It wasn't my handwriting. It wasn't my presence. And yet, it was as if I had signed my own expulsion from the life I'd built. I felt my legs weaken. Literally, my hands were still wet. Water dripped onto the dishes and the floor, and I slid down onto the kitchen stool. I tried to take a deep breath, but it felt like my air had been stolen, too, as if every inch of that house no longer belonged to me. It was as if, in the blink of an eye, I had been erased from the world. No noise, no fight, no chance to defend myself. For long minutes, I stood there, staring at the envelope, trying to understand how this was possible. I, who had always taken care of everything, who had paid every bill with sacrifice, who had raised funds to replace the roof, who had planted every flower in that yard, suddenly became an intruder in my own story, an unwelcome guest in the house that bore my name, or at least had until that moment. And it was at that moment that pain gave way to anger. A silent, profound anger that began as a lump in my throat and sank to my stomach like a stone. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just stood there, trying to mentally retrace the steps that had led me to that point. The paper I'd signed on my birthday, the realtor in the backyard, the hushed conversations, Kevin's vacant stare. Everything made sense now. The pieces fit together like a perverse puzzle, and the final image was clear. They'd deceived me. Coldly and deliberately. It's hard to explain the impact of such a betrayal. It's not just losing a home, it's losing your ground. It's being ripped from your own story with the coldness of someone signing a contract. There was no argument, no dialogue, just a piece of paper with my name forged. A hidden truth that suddenly came to light with a brutality that left no room for doubt. It was the materialization of a broken trust, the certainty that I had been used, manipulated. I got up slowly, I washed my hands, dried my face, I went to the mirror and stared at myself. There stood a 74-year-old woman, but she wasn't frail. She wasn't defeated. She was someone who had spent her entire life fighting, managing, resisting. And there, in that reflection, I knew that wouldn't be the last word. That house wouldn't disappear from my life like that, under the covers, over my dignity. The decision didn't come as an explosion, but as a kind of calm clarity, an internal transformation that didn't scream, but held firm with weight. I wasn't going to confront them at that moment. I wasn't going to expose my anger, because that battle wouldn't be won by shouting. It would be won with intelligence, with strategy, with courage, and with a strength they hadn't expected me to still possess. It was that same afternoon that I started making calls. I jotted down names. I looked for help. I called people I wasn't even sure still remembered me. One of them answered with a calm voice I'd recognize anywhere. Mr. Thompson, a retired lawyer, an old friend of my sister's. He'd attended the same church as me years ago. When I heard his hello, my voice trembled, but I kept going. Mr. Thompson, they're trying to evict me from my home. I need your help. On the other end of the line, silence. Then he replied firmly, "Tell me exactly what happened, Martha. But, first of all, know that you are not alone." Those words didn't erase the pain, but they lit a spark. It was the beginning of another journey, a journey of reconquest. And it was just beginning. That Sunday, amidst muffled chants and the smell of coffee wafting from the church kitchen, something inside me snapped. I tried to hide it, as I always did. I forced a smile for whoever greeted me at the door, sat in the same pew as always, opened the hymnal to the right page, but my hands were shaking. When I started to sing, my voice simply wouldn't come. It was as if something inside me said, "No more pretending, no more holding it all together." I remained silent throughout the service. I stared at the stained glass window in front, trying to cling to the image of peace it always portrayed. But my head was spinning. The broker's words, the bank's voice, the paper with the signature that wasn't mine, it all came back like a tape on repeat, looping over and over. And when the service ended, instead of leaving straight away, as I had for the past few months, I went to that corner near the used book table. I stood there, staring into space, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice that I needed to be seen. And that's where Mr. Thompson saw me. He arrived with his calm demeanor, a well-pressed suit, a Bible tucked under his arm, and an expression that always inspired confidence. He was a man many considered stern, but I always saw in him a sense of justice that went beyond his profession. When he greeted me, I could only say, "May I speak with you for a moment?" And he nodded, unhurriedly, as if he already understood. Something serious was going on. We went to a back room, the one where the cleaning staff keeps the cloths and conference chairs. I sat in the plastic chair, and he waited, in respectful silence, for me to begin. And I did. Unable to control my voice, unable to hide my disappointment, I told him everything. The anniversary, the signature, the letter, the feeling of being pushed out of my own life. He listened to every word. He didn't interrupt. He didn't show surprise or judgment. He simply listened, with that kind of presence that's rare, the presence of someone who truly wants to understand, not just respond. And when I finished, my eyes welling up and my body feeling lighter from finally sharing that burden, He took a deep breath and said, "Let's look at this properly, Martha. This can't go on like this." Those words were like a hug. It was the first time in a long time that I felt supported. And more than that, believed. He didn't doubt, didn't try to sugarcoat it, didn't seek excuses. He understood what I couldn't even explain properly yet. He said he needed some copies, some data, that I would have to retrieve the documents I still had. But above all, I needed to know that there was still a way, that the law still existed, and that, despite what they did to me, I still had the right to fight. That's when the key turned. Not within the process, but within me. A new mindset was emerging, a clarity born amidst the pain. I wasn't just a victim, I was the only person who could rescue what they'd tried to take from me. And that truth sank in. It gave me the courage to face what lay ahead, because I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew that dealing with these hidden truths within my own family would only bring more wounds, but the silence was already killing me inside. And for the first time, I no longer wanted to protect anyone, I wanted to protect myself. In the days that followed, I began revisiting old boxers, the ones that sit at the top of the closet and only touch when necessary. There were my bills, old contracts, copies of records I'd kept since I bought the house. I found photos from the day the deed was signed, the first renovation, the slab being laid with the help of neighbors. All of this reminded me of the journey I'd taken. A journey made of difficult decisions, silent sacrifices, and victories that were never celebrated. Each piece of paper was more than a document, it was a witness to my story. Mr. Thompson began visiting me, always polite, direct, but with a patience that seemed to come from another time. He read everything, asked questions carefully, and explained the behind-the-scenes details of what might be happening. He spoke of fraudulent identity theft, fraudulent registration, and illegally obtained notarization. And I was astonished by what I heard, because until then, I hadn't even known this kind of scam could happen within one's own family. But he knew. He'd seen other cases, though few so well disguised. He said the signature could be challenged, that a lawsuit was possible, that there was still time, and, most importantly, that the impact of this fight wasn't just legal, it was moral. It was about restoring my voice, my autonomy, my presence. His every word stirred something inside me. It wasn't just about justice, it was about dignity, about not letting myself be placed in a role that wasn't mine, about reclaiming control of my story. And with each conversation, I felt myself rebuilding, not with anger, but with purpose. Because when you spend your whole life caring for others, there comes a time when you have to decide, either you keep disappearing, or you learn to see yourself again. And that's when I realized my journey wasn't over. It was just changing direction. The first time I entered the courthouse, my hands were freezing. On the outside, I tried to maintain a firm posture, a serene expression, like someone accustomed to this kind of environment. But inside, everything was shaken. I never thought that, at 74, I would be sitting before a judge, fighting for my right to exist in my own home. Even more so, having to look my son in the eye, not as a mother, but as an injured party in a lawsuit. Irony is like that. Sometimes, it's in the very place where we've given everything that we need to start defending ourselves. Mr. Thompson stood beside me, calm as ever. He had organized each document as if he were preparing a life defense, not just a legal case. He presented evidence, pointed out irregularities, and explained in detail the context of my forged signature. And there, in that cold, bureaucratic environment, my story was pieced together, piece by piece, but now with a different voice. A voice that no longer pleaded for understanding, but demanded justice. When Kevin was called to testify, I felt a strange weight on my chest. He entered with his head down, wearing a dark suit and a lost look in his eyes. He wasn't the same boy who drew hearts on Mother's Day cards. He was a man trying to hide behind technical terms, surrounded by lawyers who barely knew who he was. The judge questioned him directly about the documents, the sales process, the signatures, and, in the face of these questions, his silence said it all. It was one of those heavy, burdensome silences that imposed themselves more than any answer. Kevin looked away, stammered, and avoided meeting anyone's eyes. And it was at that moment that I felt the turning point, not like in a movie, with screams and dramatic revelations, but simply, directly, as only the truth can. The judge looked at me, paused, and said with a firmness that echoes in my memory to this day, You're right, this was a scam. I can't explain the exact feeling. It was as if all the air had returned to my lungs. As if, finally, someone had confirmed what I'd been silently screaming for months. I'd been deceived. I'd been betrayed. And yes, I was right. To fight that sentence was more than a legal decision. It was a redemption, a reunion with myself, with the woman who, for so long, had been taught to give in, to accept, to swallow hard to keep the peace. But in that courtroom, it was no longer about keeping the peace. It was about restoring the truth. It was about showing that, even when they try to erase us, there is always a way back. Kevin left before me. We didn't exchange a word. He avoided looking at me, as if he couldn't face his own reflection in what he'd done. And, curiously, I didn't feel anger. It wasn't hatred that moved me. It was something else. It was a kind of clarity that comes after pain. A clearer conscience that doesn't need to scream to be heard. I didn't want revenge. I wanted reparations. I wanted my place back, not just in the house, but in the world. And, in that moment, I was getting it. In the following days, much changed. I walked around the house with a different attitude, no longer as someone treading on threatened territory, but as the owner of what I had built. Each room seemed to breathe with me. The light entered differently. The smell of coffee in the morning had a different flavor. It was as if the house knew I had returned whole, even though I had been broken inside. And that is priceless. It's the kind of victory you don't see on paper, but you feel in your heart. The neighborhood also resonated. Some neighbors stopped me on the street, saying they'd heard about the case, asking how I had the courage. And I told them that courage, sometimes, isn't a choice. It's the only path forward when everything you have is about to be taken away, and that no one should remain silent in the face of injustice, no matter how disguised. My story wasn't unique. I knew that. Many other women, mothers, grandmothers, go through similar situations, but not all have someone like Mr. Thompson by their side. And that's when I understood the true impact of this journey. It wasn't just about me. It was about the right to age with dignity, to be respected, to continue having a voice, even when society tries to silence us with phrases like "she's lived enough" or "she doesn't understand things anymore." It was about fighting a mentality that reduces our lives to a bunch of numbers, contracts, and conveniences. And this battle, I realized, cannot be won alone. I started writing everything down, every step, every pain, every revelation. Not because I wanted to relive the wound, but because I needed this truth to spread, for others to understand that behind every silent gesture lies a woman who feels, who thinks, who decides, who transforms, and this transformation has no age limit. Justice, in that case, was served, but the healing process was still ongoing. It wasn't just a matter of home, of ownership, of registered title. It was a matter of belonging, of reclaiming the narrative of my own life, of looking in the mirror and recognizing who I was, and most importantly, who I refused to stop being. Returning to living alone was both a fresh start and an affirmation. Not of loneliness, because being alone doesn't mean being of the freedom to once again fill every space in the house with my presence. The silence that once frightened me now welcomed me. It was a silence that didn't hurt, but rather healed. Each morning, I opened the windows and let the light in with greater intention. It wasn't just the sun hitting the curtains. It was a kind of re-inauguration of my own life. The first few days were slow. Not for lack of will, but because I needed to listen to myself again. After so much time being interrupted, disbelieved, ignored, I no longer remembered what it was like to fully trust my own decisions. It was like relearning to walk around the house with a different perspective. A firmer, more self-possessed perspective. I began to notice details that had previously escaped me. The crack near the window, the smell in the closet, the sound of birds in the morning. Everything seemed clearer, as if the house were waiting for me to return in one piece. I decided, then, to start with my hands, because it was with them that I built everything I've ever had in life. The same hands that embroidered trousseaux, prepared birthday parties, curbed fevers, and comforted silences. I took the old fabrics I still had and spread them out on the living room table. I opened the boxes of thread, set up the sewing machine, and cleaned every corner of the small back room, the one that had been abandoned for so long, filled with trinkets and moldy memories. And there, in that space, I created my little studio, a place of my own, a nest of reconstruction. I started sewing slowly, a pillow here, a dishcloth there, No rush, no obligation. Just the pleasure of producing with my heart. The sound of the machine once again filled the house with an energy I hadn't felt in years. It was as if each stitch, each fold, each seam was restitching my identity. I wasn't just a retired lady. I was a creator. A woman with hands that still had much to do. Little by little, neighbors began knocking on my door. Some asking for small adjustments, others just to check on me. One of them, Donna Estella, brought me a box full of flowery fabrics and said, "You're too talented to let this sit." And I smiled. It wasn't about money, it was about meaning, about filling my days with something that blossomed from within, with purpose and beauty. I renovated the garden too. I planted new flowers, removed the rocks, and weeded the flower beds. The soil in my hands felt good. There was something profoundly transformative about getting my nails dirty with the same soil that once sustained my children. Each seedling I placed there seemed to say, "You're alive, and you still bloom." The house took on new life, not through the furniture, but through the energy that circulated between the walls. I let natural light flood the rooms, removed heavy curtains, and painted the front door blue. I wanted it to tell the world that someone who had started over lived there. This transformation didn't just come from the house. It was born within me. Because when we survive a betrayal of this depth, it's easy to believe we've lost everything. But I discovered that there's something no one can steal, the strength of someone who rises after being forgotten. It was this strength that made me stop asking for permission to exist. Let go of the fear of disturbing others, of being seen as exaggerated, too sensitive. I'm not too much, I'm whole. I began writing my memoirs at night, a simple, hardcover notebook, where I began recording the most memorable moments of my life. Not to dramatize, but to document, because I understood that my story has value, and valuable stories need to be told. What I experienced could be the reality of other women, other mothers, so many grandmothers who, after everything they did, were cast aside like antique furniture. This writing became a ritual. With a cup of tea by my side, I would sit and let the words flow. Sometimes they hurt, sometimes they soothed. But in all of them, there was truth. And more than that, there was freedom. The freedom to look back honestly, without needing to sugarcoat anything. Because my dignity doesn't reside in pretty versions. It resides in the courage to face the wounds, to wipe away the dried blood, and keep walking. And it was in this rhythm, between one stitch and the next, between one sentence in the notebook and another, that I realized the greatest legacy I can leave is not what's in my name, but what lives on in my decisions. The house is important, of course, but more important is what I did with it after all this, what I did to myself, and what I'm doing now. What no one told me and what I had to discover for myself is that there's a quiet power in keeping going, in holding your head up when they expect you to give up, in taking your place without asking permission. This power doesn't come from youth, nor from physical strength. It comes from the soul. And when you access it, no one can move you against your will. He appeared on an ordinary morning, the kind when the wind smells of fresh coffee and the birds are celebrating in the garden. I was watering the plants, already wearing gloves, my apron dirty with dirt and peace in my heart, when I heard the gate slam twice. I looked through the fronds of a fern and saw that face I'd known since I was a boy, the same one that smiled toothlessly at me for the first time, the same one that slept in my lap when the world outside seemed too big. But now, something was different. It wasn't just the time that had passed. It was the weight of shame in his eyes. Kevin was there, alone, his head bowed, with a posture of someone who no longer knew where he fit, his hands shoved in his pockets as if trying to hide his guilt. He stood there for a few seconds, until he said, almost in a whisper, "Mom, can I talk to you?" I didn't answer. I just stared at him. It was as if I were watching a stranger trying to fit into a story that no longer fit him. He entered slowly, without stepping on the flower beds, as if he already knew that this house was no longer his place. She sat in the porch chair, the same one his father used to sit in before everything, and she began to talk. Words jumbled, excuses jumbled. He said he felt lost, that he'd been pressured by Susan, that he hadn't wanted things to get this far, that it had all started with worry about the future, and that before he knew it, he was too far gone to back out. "We made a mistake, Mom. I know you won't forgive me, but I had to come." I listened to everything without interrupting, not out of coldness, but because I'd learned that sometimes silence is the greatest mirror. I let him speak, let him expose himself, let him get tangled up in his own words, because this was no longer the place for confrontation. It was the moment of truth, and that truth he would have to swallow with the taste of his own choice. When he finished, a silence fell between us, one of those heavy silences, smelling of the past, tasting of hurt, and weighing down decisions. I looked him straight in the eye, not with anger, but with the firmness of someone who's learned to never diminish themselves. And then I said, my voice low, but charged with everything I was, Kevin, whoever takes a roof over their mother's head sleeps outside. He didn't answer. He just lowered his eyes, as if bearing a sentence he already knew was coming. He stood slowly and walked to the gate, and I, with the same hand that once held his to cross the street, closed the gate behind him. I didn't cry, my legs didn't tremble, I didn't need to lean against the wall. It was one of those cathartic moments where pain transforms into dignity, where the past fits into its rightful place, and we understand that forgiving isn't going back, nor is it forgetting. It's just about no longer carrying what doesn't belong to us. I no longer felt the need for him to see me the same way he used to, because I had already found myself again. What came next was a different silence. Not the silence of abandonment, nor of loneliness, but that rare silence that accompanies those who have learned to say no with serenity, who know that justice doesn't have to be revenge, that it's enough to restore what was violated. And in that moment, deep inside, I knew I was restored. The house remained the same the next day, the same plants, the same dirt path, the same antique clock on the kitchen wall. But there was something in the air, a lightness that only comes after a wound heals. I began to water the plants more calmly, to prepare my coffee without rushing, to sleep with the windows open, like someone breathing a sigh of relief after years of holding their breath. In the days that followed, I told no one about his visit, not even my closest neighbors, not even Mr. Thompson. I kept it to myself, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for my own process. Some stories, once they've ended, don't need to be retold. They need to be lived with silence and gratitude. And it was in this silence that I realized how much I had changed. The journey took me down paths I never would have imagined. It made me face ghosts I pretended not to see. It forced me to reevaluate my decisions, my limits, my very identity. And in this reevaluation, I rediscovered parts of myself I had forgotten. The strong woman, the proud housewife, the mother who knew exactly what she carried on her shoulders, the grandmother who still had much to teach and would no longer accept being silenced. This was no longer just my home. It was the home of my soul, a place where every detail told a story, but where, now, the narrative was in my hands. There was no more room for shadows, nor for voices telling me what I should feel, do, or think. What existed there was a whole woman, and this woman still had much to live for. You know, after everything I've been through, after the betrayal, the shock, the process, the transformation, I realized that this story was never just about me. It was never just about a house, a lost child, or a piece of paper signed in bad faith. It was about something much deeper, the way society treats those who've already given everything and suddenly are seen as excessive, as if aging were synonymous with a burden, as if the time we spend caring for others is forgotten at the first sign of weakness. But what few understand is that the love that builds a family also knows how to protect itself when threatened. Many people think dignity is a luxury, that it's something reserved for those with titles, possessions, or status. But dignity is something else. Dignity is getting up every day, even when hurt, and choosing not to bow to what diminishes us. It's keeping our eyes steady, even when words try to erase us. It's standing tall, even when the ground has been pulled from under us. And I've learned that there's a serene power in keeping going, even if no one applauds, even if no one apologizes, even if everything around us tells us it would be easier to give up. The other day, I sat in my garden and watched a butterfly land from flower to flower, and I thought about how life changes us, sometimes subtly, sometimes brutally. I thought about the girl I was, the mother I became, the woman I rediscovered myself as, and I understood, there, among the plants that bloomed again, that no pain was in vain. Every tear I shed washed me clean. Every silence I endured taught me to listen better. Every injustice I faced pushed me closer to myself. Not the version they expected, but the version I needed to be. The truth is, this story doesn't end with the closing of a gate. nor with a court ruling. It continues here inside, as a living reminder that those with deep roots are not easily toppled. The house stood, so did I, and more than that, tie became a home. For myself, a shelter that doesn't depend on anyone's approval. A story that no longer needs to be told by others. I am the author of my life. With all the pain, the failures, the falls, and with all the victories that never made the front page, but made me who I am. If you have a mother, a grandmother, a story, respect it. Don't wait for her to scream for you to listen. Don't wait for her to ask you to care. Because often, the women in our lives have already given everything they could, and are only waiting for a little recognition in return. A gesture, a word, a look. And if you are that woman, know this: what they take from you may even hurt, but what you rebuild with your own hands has another value. A value that cannot be sold, signed, or falsified. For a long time, I thought love meant accepting everything, that protecting your family meant silently enduring anything. But love also means setting boundaries. It also means saying enough with a firm voice. It also means teaching that trust isn't eternal when it's betrayed. Because when love becomes an excuse for emotional violence, it's no longer love, it's control. And no one came into this world to be a puppet in any story. I also learned that justice doesn't always come the way we expect. Sometimes it comes slowly. Other times, in the eyes of a judge who hears what so many women have never been able to say out loud. Sometimes, justice doesn't come in the form of a sentence, but in the form of liberation, when you stop trying to prove your worth to those who never made the effort to see it. And perhaps, in the end, that's what touched me most on this journey. The revelation that my strength didn't depend on anyone. That what rebuilt me wasn't the forgiveness of others, but what I chose to forgive myself. The time I let slip by, the voice I silenced, the guilt I carried, and the courage that, deep down, was always there. It just needed space to emerge. So, if one day they try to take from you what is sacred, what represents your history, your memory, your home, whether physical or emotional, remember what I'm going to tell you now. Whoever takes away a mother's roof ends up sleeping rough, because life may take its time, but it returns. Sometimes with wind, sometimes with silence, but always with justice. And when justice arrives, it doesn't ask permission, it enters, and makes us whole again. If this story touched you in any way, if at any point you felt like it was your voice speaking to you, leave it here in the comments. I'm with you until the end, Martha, because when we share what touches our soul, the message goes further and finds other people who also need to hear it. And if this kind of story resonates with you, inspires you, or awakens something different within you, subscribe to the channel here. Every story has truth, pain, and resilience, and room for us to grow together. And don't forget to like this video. It helps this message continue to reach those who often feel like they're alone on this journey. There's a video here that complements this journey. Click and follow me there. We still have a lot to live for and to talk about.